To talk about what we've been debating today on the Senate floor, the Waters of the U.S. rule and the legislation that has gotten bipartisan support so far. We think needs a lot more support here on why this is so important for the country. You know, unfortunately, the bill, Senator Barrasso's bill, I was a co-sponsor of, unfortunately that bill didn't get the 60 votes necessary, but Senator Ernst has a resolution that I think it's going to be very important to pass. It would stop this rule from being enacted by the EPA, and hopefully we'll see if the president, once this is put on his desk, has some common sense to sign it rather than veto it. But what I wanted to talk about, I wanted to actually put this rule in a much broader context, to put the debate we're having here today on the Waters of the U.S. rule into the broader context of actually what's happening in our country and how the EPA's Waters of the U.S. rule is actually a symbol for much broader problems that I think the vast majority of Americans recognize. The other night, Mr. President, I went to the premiere of a short film on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, what we call in Alaska TAPS. Let me tell you a little bit about TAPS. It's Alaska's 800-mile artery of steel that was done in the most responsible manner in terms of the environment, that brings much energy to our country. When it was built, it was actually one of the biggest private sector construction projects ever in the history of our great nation, and literally, directly and indirectly employed tens of thousands of Americans. It has carried almost 17 billion barrels of oil, American oil, to energy-thirsty American markets and continued to provide thousands and thousands of jobs, not only in Alaska, but throughout the country. And it is certainly a technological and environmental marvel. And here's the thing, Mr. President, that kind of huge project was built in 3 years. Think about that. 800 miles of steel pipeline crossing 3 mountain ranges, more than 30 major rivers and streams. It took Americans 3 years to build that. One look at TAPS, you go to Alaska, you still see it functioning incredibly well today. You're reminded of how when this nation puts its mind to something, we can get great things done. And that system, that incredible energy infrastructure system, in many ways, Congress played a critical role in making sure that happened. We are a great nation. But I must admit, when I was watching this movie last week with a bunch of Alaskans, Senator Murkowski, Don Young, and others, I did feel a sense of unease, almost a little nostalgia, when we were watching this film about this great project that Americans came together from all over the country to build. Because we all know that we used to do great things here, to build great things. Let me give you a few examples. Again, in Alaska, what's called the Alcan Highway, the Alaska-Canada Highway, through some of the world's most rugged terrain, 1,700 miles. That was built in under a year. We built the Empire State Building, 410 days. We built the Pentagon in 16 months. The Hoover Dam, the interstate highway system, putting a man on the moon. I could go on and on and on. When you look at the history of this country, it's a history of getting big things done. And it's not just getting big things done. These projects were a symbol of American pride, American greatness. And they also created tens of thousands of jobs, great jobs, middle-class jobs, which gave workers a sense that what they were doing was really important in their daily lives and really important to their country. You know, even in Alaska still, when you talk to someone who worked on TAPS, who constructed this for the country, they talk about it in terms of pride, in terms of what they were doing for their state, but also what they were doing for America, and how everybody came together to build this. But here's a sad fact, Mr. President. These kind of projects are not being built today. Instead, we have become a red tape nation. Instead of symbols of technological wonder and national pride and American ingenuity, we now hear story after story, and we've all heard them here in the Senate, of delay and discord and disappointment, all of which symbolizes today a country that can't get things done. And the main culprit is right here, Washington, D.C., the capital of dysfunction. Whether it's the Keystone Pipeline, transmission lines in California, or bridges, or highways, or runways across the country, killing crucial development and infrastructure projects through permitting and regulatory delay and federal agency overreach with new rules upon new rules, and all they do is stop development. And this certainly has been a hallmark of the Obama administration. And the WOTUS rule, the EPA's Waters of the U.S. rule, is just the latest manifestation of this. But as you know, Mr. President, this is happening all over the country. Frequently, because of the political risks, the President and members of his administration, like Gina McCarthy, won't openly oppose economic development projects. Instead, they'll wrap them in red tape until they delay them to death. Let me give you some examples. In 2008, Shell acquired leases in the Arctic Ocean off the coast of Alaska for over $2 billion. So that's a company going to the federal government. The federal government is saying, we want to lease this land to you. A company says, we'll give you billions in return. Federal government, that money's already been spent, the billions, to develop natural resources. Of course, this was big news in Alaska. New production of oil would have filled up 3/4 of taps, which I talked about earlier. It would have created jobs. Some estimates are in the tens of thousands of jobs, direct and indirect jobs, provided much needed state and local revenue and energy security for our country. So what happened? Remember, the federal government is inviting a private sector company to do this. It didn't take long for this project to run into a maddening array of often conflicting and confusing permitting challenges, drilling moratoriums, new regulations, environmental lawsuits, permitting confusions that year after year kept the drill bit above the ground. Now, jump to 2015. What had once been a very robust exploration program has resulted in what happened this summer. The permission, finally, to drill one exploration well off the coast of Alaska, where hundreds of wells have already been drilled safely. We've been doing this safely in Alaska for decades. Let me sum that up. It took 7 years, $7 billion to get permission to drill one exploration well in 100 feet of water. 7 years, $7 billion to finally get the federal government's permission to drill one single exploration well in 100 feet of water. No company in the world can endure that. This was a project that was meant to be delayed until it was killed. Some of my colleagues have been celebrating this. Well, I think that's sad, because what they're really celebrating, they're celebrating the loss of really good jobs for Americans throughout the country. In many ways, they're celebrating what is a symbol of America's decline. because these resources in the Arctic are going to be developed one way or the other. And it's either going to be by countries like us that have the highest standards, most responsible standards on the environment, or countries like Russia and China who don't. So the Russians and Chinese are not going to be charged there. They're going to be producing energy. They're going to be getting the jobs, and they're not going to care at all about the environment. So instead of a win-win-win for the United States, this is a lose-lose-lose. And yet, we have members of this body celebrating this. But this, again, Mr. President, is not a problem confined to my state or energy programs in terms of the delay. Let me provide a few examples. We had a recent Senate Commerce Committee hearing on aviation infrastructure. Everybody thinks aviation infrastructure is important. I certainly do. The manager of the Seattle airport was testifying. He talked about, as part of his role as the CEO of the American Association of Airport Executives, he talked about how it took almost 4 years to build the Seattle airport's new runway. So to build a new runway. Seems like a fair amount of time, but maybe a construction project like that takes a fair amount of time. But I had a question for him, which I didn't know the answer to. I asked him, how long did it take to get the federal permits, to go through the federal permitting system to build this additional runway at the Seattle airport? His answer, 15 years. 15 years to get the federal permits to build a runway. You could have heard, well, you did hear, the whole committee, the whole audience, they just gasped. And then he said, quote, they built the Great Pyramids of Egypt faster than that, unquote. This is what's going on in our country. And we're to blame. This town, it's happening all over the country, Mr. President. Americans need to know this. Permitting a desalination plant, which would provide much needed fresh water to drought-stricken California. That only took 9 years to permit that. Simply raising a bridge in New York, not building a new bridge, raising a new one, took 5 years, the same bridge, and 20,000 pages of federal permitting requirements. The average time it now takes in America to get federal approval for a major highway project is more than 6 years. 6 years. Again, not to build the highway, to just get the federal permission. It took almost 20 years, if you include the litigation, to get the federal permission to build a single gold mine in Alaska. 20 years. We had to take that all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court because the federal government was not supporting us. Now that mine, the Kensington mine, employs over 300 people at an average wage of $100,000 per person. Those are great jobs. Those are great jobs. And we have a federal government that wants to delay. Let's talk about the Keystone Pipeline. We had a debate here. 7 years and counting to build a pipeline. 7 years and counting in terms of the federal permits. Who's hurt by this? Our friends on the other side, they talk a lot about the companies and everything that, TransCanada. The people who are hurt by this are American families, middle-class workers, union members. Mr. President, one of the most surprising things I saw as a freshman this year when we were debating the override of the Keystone Pipeline, the State Department had predicted this would create as many as 30,000 jobs. These are good jobs, construction jobs, real Americans working to build something important. I was presiding in the chair like you, Mr. President, and some of the members on the other side of the aisle started arguing, these aren't real jobs because they're temporary. This isn't going to create 30,000 jobs because they're temporary jobs. I about fell out of my chair. Construction jobs aren't real jobs? Since when is that the case? According to the President's own Small Business Administration, the regulatory costs on small businesses in the United States per year are close to $2 trillion per year. That's $15,000 per family. The bottom line is, we know we can do better. We have to do better if we want to grow this country and want to create jobs. But I believe there's a silver lining. I believe, Mr. President, things have gotten so bad that this delay that's happening everywhere on projects that matter for us as a nation, projects that are so weighted down under red tape, is making Americans, regardless of party, start to take note. And I've seen a silver lining here. Both Democrats and Republicans are starting to demand change. They're demanding bold and serious regulatory reform. And I've had conversations with members of both sides of the aisle here about how important this is for our economy, how important it is for jobs. And that's why this debate today on the waters of the United States is so important. You know, unfortunately, we didn't get the number of bills. We did have a pretty strong bipartisan group. I think we would have gotten to 59, one vote short to move forward. It's unfortunate that the other side couldn't see the merits of this. But this rule will not help grow our economy. This rule will continue to stifle growth. This rule will certainly continue to kill jobs. It takes what we all want, certainly, the whole idea of protecting our water, clean water. In my state of Alaska, we have the cleanest water any state in the country. We win awards every year for our clean, pristine water. And it's not because the EPA is making that happen, it's because Alaskans are making that happen. But it takes the Clean Water Act and somehow through a rule that the EPA has devised itself, gives the EPA the power to regulate not major rivers, but water in our backyards, literally. And almost certainly this rule doesn't comport with federal law. We've had 2 courts now say that. There's a stay on it nationally. The Sixth Circuit has put a stay on this rule. Over 30 states, think about that, Mr. President, 30 states have sued to stop this rule, a bipartisan coalition of states, because it's almost certainly not legal. You know, I asked Administrator McCarthy about the legal opinion, the legal basis that they had for this rule. Never gotten an answer from the EPA administrator. Never gotten an answer. And I'm not sure they really even care. You know, the last 2 Supreme Court terms, the EPA has lost 2 big cases in the U.S. Supreme Court. They've lost the Sixth Circuit case for now. And unfortunately, we had the administrator of the EPA on TV recently, a few months ago, on the eve of this Supreme Court case, EPA versus Michigan, when asked if she was going to win the case, she said, "We think we're going to win, but ultimately it doesn't really matter because the companies have already had to comply with hundreds of millions of dollars." Think about that. Think about what she said. Well, this rule is going to have a huge, profound impact on my state. Alaska has more waters under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act than any other state in the country. Over 50% of America's wetlands are located in Alaska. Mr. President, I held multiple field hearings as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Fisheries, Water, and Wildlife on the Water of the United States rule. And it is clear to me that Alaskans of vastly different backgrounds, ideologies, different parts of the state are opposed to this rule. One group in my state said the rule would, quote, straitjacket any development. Another said it would have negative impacts on virtually any economic development project in Alaska. One project that we're very focused on in Alaska, we're having a special session right now in our state legislature, is the Alaska LNG project, a very large-scale LNG project that, like TAPS, will be great for the country, create thousands of jobs, energy security for Americans and our allies. And this rule, if left in its present form, will very negatively impact the costs and timeline of that project. Simply put, Mr. President, the waters of the U.S. is one of the largest land grabs in history, and it is an example of the kind of challenges we need to address here to get our economy moving again, to create good jobs for Americans, and it's why this debate we're having is so important. These are problems we can fix. We know we can fix it. Americans sent us here to fix these problems, and we need to start by stopping rules like the waters of the U.S. that undermine our country's future and the jobs that we need throughout this country. Mr. President, I yield the floor.